huge favor and check out the link on the registration. Not a single person's logged on yet for Zoom. That's what I said on the reminder, that people will send the last one. Just where are you? Oh, I'm in a panic. Do you see me? Let me see. Okay, here we go. I got it.
Hello, Therese. It's just me. I'm leaving now.
I love you.
Bye.
Bye. Hello. How are you, Tom?
Hi, Therese. Good, thank you. Thank you for letting me in.
I'm going to be letting a lot of people in. Here we go.
I'm sure. So good to see you.
Always.
Hello, John.
Hello, all.
Hello, Ann.
I am.
Oh.
Hey, Lauren. How are you? Good. Did you guys sing last night? I was not here. I think there were. I thought so. Just seeing all of the equipment. Yes. Yeah. How's your world? Pretty good. Lots of class. Yeah. Exciting. Crazy. It truly flew by. Wow. And you're so good. I'm from Burlington. Also not too far. We'll head out for the Thanksgiving. Yeah. Everything's going to be so good, right? I know. Be careful, Connie. Thank you. No, thank you for being here. Oh, no, I have so much gratitude. Yeah?
Hello, Therese.
Hey, Kathy Maloney.
How are ya?
Not too shabby, can't complain. There's a lot of people. are you?
Good. How are you?
I was just talking about you, Nora.
Oh, you were.
Is it time?
No,
Nope,
2
2
minutes.
minutes. Okay. I think I'm gonna unmask, because I think I'm muffled under this
I
mask.
agree. You'll be, yeah.
Hello, Eleanor.
You're giving up exam study?
Yes.
It is held up, yeah.
And so I have one exam tomorrow night and one exam Friday.
It's the last day of class today.
Oh, the last day. Oh,
Wait a minute, I thought we were having one the beginning of, through the first week in December.
Lauren, one of our students who attends, she just said it's the last day of class.
For UNC.
Oh, for UNC. Okay. Thanks.
Hello, Pete.
Aloha.
10. It is exactly 1:30.
I'm gonna unmask, lest my voice be muffled too much, especially for the Zoom participants. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 3, where we'll look at the immigrant experience of the American church. Remember again, next week we are off for Thanksgiving week, and the week after that will be the Black and Indigenous peoples experience, and then the final week, the creation of a Catholic subculture and its dissolution, which takes us up to contemporary times. Okay. The first major wave of immigration, most American historians would say, ends pretty much with the Civil War. And when we look at how it affects the Catholic Church, we of course have to start with, hello, you just worked. Why are you not working?
I tested it. No, it worked. Unless the battery went dead.
Just, there it is, okay. So we have to start with Irish immigration. Irish immigration is really occasioned by the potato famine or the potato blight. Ireland, by the 19th century, had become a one-crop agricultural society. When the potato crop started to fail, it became increasingly critical by the middle part of the 1840s. And this is really the engine that drove Irish immigration to the United States. Ireland in the 19th century was essentially unchanged since the Middle Ages. That is, a predominantly peasant population tied to land, essentially a serf population tied to English landowners or Anglo-Irish landowners. And the Irish basically lived at subsistence level. Such that, of course, when the blight came, when you're at subsistence level to begin with, there's not much further to fall. So Irish society was precarious already by the 1830s, 1840s. The Irish immigration that comes to the United States prior to 1830 is typically Protestant, and it's typically what's called Scots-Irish. If you were to look in particularly the Piedmont area of the Carolinas, and moving into the central part of the states, an awful lot of what we would call the hard-scrabble early colonials were Scots-Irish. That is, from Northern Ireland, with an import from Scotland, predominantly Protestant. That's prior to 1830. Ronald Reagan's family, for example, when he traced his ancestral roots back, Ronald Reagan's family fell precisely into this camp. In the 1850s, 12% of the Irish population emigrated. 12%. That would be something akin to 40 million Americans leaving this country in one decade. That's astounding when you stop and think about it. They came to the New World in what they called coffin ships. The coffin ships were, frankly, for the most part, reconverted slave trading ships. The various maritime powers, beginning in the 1840s, for moral reasons, began to abandon the slave trade. But you still had ships that were equipped to carry mass humanity in inhuman conditions. Therefore, let's just repurpose them for the Irish. Because of years and years and years of malnourishment and undernourishment, the Irish population traveling on these ships was already subject to communicable disease. Their immune systems were already very far down and weakened because of malnourishment. And because they came from predominantly a peasant society, they had no job skills. When they arrived in the New World, because they had no job skills, they tended to do the hardest, the messiest, the most dangerous, and the most manual and menial of labor in the United States. It is estimated that the average Irish adult male in his 20s had a life expectancy of 6 years when he arrived in the New World. That also is rather astounding. Irish women also immigrated en masse. Both the Irish young men and the Irish young women arrived in the United States unmarried. Why? In Irish culture at the time, you would not be permitted to marry unless you could develop and sustain an economic basis for marriage. Therefore, these ships are full of unmarried, young, single women who come to the United States and disproportionately work as maids, as cooks, as housekeepers, as au pairs, and unskilled, single male laborers, who first start off essentially in the ditch digging class. But as soon as possible, the Irish males found their way up in any kind of organized work, such as police, fire, the church, and unions. And the typical pattern is the first Irish would break in. And then, of course, he would help somebody else break in. And they both would help other people break in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they worked their way up very easily, this organizational strata. In many Northeastern American cities, even today, a disproportionate number of fire departments and police departments are still Irish. And you sense that very commonly at these funerals. If you remember, after 9/11, they were almost all accompanied by bagpipes. It's that ancestral kind of Celtic memory, and it still holds very much in a lot of places. When these peasants came to large American cities, and the Irish disproportionately wound up in large cities because of the need for labor and wages. They wound up in these cities completely dislocated from a small, intimate Irish village centered around the parish church and the pub into a large, teeming, disease-ridden, poorly sanitized, poorly ventilated American urban neighborhood. Additionally, one of the social factors that always tends to solidify people's sociological outlook is marriage. So, with all of these unmarried young males and all of these unmarried young females, don't be surprised if you have a much, much higher incidence of social maladies. First and foremost, alcoholism. Secondly, crime. Third, disease. Again, they arrived already sick and malnourished, and work in the New World didn't help them out too much. And because of the pressures of all of this, frankly speaking, insanity. So you can very quickly see that the WASP American urban elite looked down upon these Irish immigrants with horrible disdain. Horrible disdain. Thomas Nast, in some of his cartoons, portrayed the Irish immigrants as apes wearing shillelaghs. That's the typical viewpoint of what these things would look like. One could find in any number of stores signs on the front door that says no dogs or Irish allowed. Very common during this time frame period. However, like virtually every other immigrant group in the United States, after a couple of generations, there is the emergence of what was called lace curtain Irish. That is, a certain number of Irish who had made it into the lower middle class. And therefore, the sign that you were able to do that was putting lace curtains up in your house. Check the cartoon. A large, overloaded boat entitled The Poorhouse of Galway, and a small little native New Yorker coming out with a little ship called the Dynamite. One gets the feeling from this exactly how welcome Irish immigrants were to the United States. What was their experience of Catholicism that they brought? Catholicism in Ireland was persecuted and had been persecuted since the time of Henry VIII, but very strongly persecuted since the time of Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. Therefore, the Catholic experience in Ireland was fervent. The principal churches had all been converted into Church of Ireland as opposed to Roman Catholic. Therefore, church buildings were small, nondescript, not well decorated, not imposing. Ireland in the 19th century had one of its famous church leaders, Cardinal Cullen. Cardinal Cullen, who was the primate of Ireland for at least a 30-year period in the middle part of the 19th century, imprinted upon the Irish an intense devotional piety. Again, it wasn't possible to imprint a liturgical piety because they lacked the facilities in the churches with the great organs, the great choirs, etc., etc. And the churches were typically small. Devotional piety can, of course, be done at home. and Paul Cullen attempted to turn every Irish Catholic family into a center of devotion. Daily rosary, litanies, litanies to the Sacred Heart, all of these kinds of things will be done in church as well. And the various groups of Irish immigrants, some of them came already having this immigrant devotional mentality brought with them. Others, it was inculcated in the United States. In 1842, the Irish Church founded All Hallows College to provide training of clergy, especially training of clergy to come to the United States, Canada, England, and Australia. For the Irish, Catholicism is an ethnic badge. If you remember some years back, when an Irish-American gay and lesbian group wanted to march in the St. Patrick's Day parade, the St. Patrick's Day parade, which has precious little to do with faith and much more to do with green beer and partying. John Cardinal O'Connor of New York took that to court, stating that this Irish national festival was a religious festival. And therefore, the religious organizers could keep that group out. They lost in court. To me, quite obviously. But that gives you the notion of where ethnic identity and Catholicism melded together. When the Irish came to the United States, while Gaelic was still somewhat spoken in Ireland, the Irish had pretty much moved completely into learning the imperial tongue of English. When the Irish arrived in the United States and formed their parishes were the de facto parishes where English was spoken. Therefore, they became the de facto territorial parish in these great cities. And therefore, because the Irish clergy dominated the territorial parish, the Irish clergy very quickly began to dominate the ranks of the American episcopacy. Such that by the latter part of the 19th century, other than certain areas where the Germans dominated, Irish clergy dominated the episcopal ranks of the United States pretty much across the board. Now, these Irish, with their particular blend, it was very strong ethnic ties. Again, the loyal Hibernians, as an example. These ethnic groups, these ethnic clubs that are still quite strong, even with younger people today, which flies in the face of a lot of other sociological research. The one area where the Irish were distinctly poor is liturgy. The pre-conciliar understanding of liturgy in an Irish parish was a series of rather quick and perfunctory low masses, where the priest essentially quietly said the Latin prayers with his back to the congregation, and the congregation patiently waited to leave. Some years back, there was a famous book written, Why American Catholics Don't Sing. And that book essentially was an indictment of the Irish parish. Because again, the Irish had such a low sense of liturgy and a low sense of liturgical celebration that there was very little singing. And the singing that took place was of a highly devotional character to accompany the novena, not to accompany Mass. In addition, this low sense the Irish did not bring any Irish hymns over with them. If you look in the bottom notes of virtually any hymnal, how many of them come from Anglican sources, German sources, or Welsh sources? Virtually nothing from the Irish. Again, nothing because they came from a situation that could produce, frankly, nothing. Let's stop there for a moment and see if there's any questions on the Irish experience. We'll start with in-house. Okay, move over to the Zoomers.
Okay.
Any questions, Zoomers?
Yes, can you hear me? It's Ann.
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, my parents are from Galway, and so I'm very well acquainted with what you're talking about. How important was the Irish American or Irish priest in the Boston area in politics?
The question is the importance of Irish clergy, particularly the Boston area, in politics. Since the Irish were rather good at any organizational thing, this of course also meant the great political machines of the great American cities. By the 1920s, there's an interesting phenomenon of Catholic bishops organizing mass rallies of Catholics in order to demonstrate to the political power that if I want to tap into these people, I can. So the 1920s, for example, you'll see things like bishops organizing Eucharistic processions going through the downtown streets with thousands of Catholic school children and phalanxes of Catholic nuns in every outfit, and then thousands of Catholic Holy Name Society members and thousands of Knights of Columbus in full regalia, etc., etc. And almost always on the reviewing stand is the bishop in full episcopal regalia with all of the Irish politicians or those politicians who knew that the Irish vote elected them. So yes, there is a tremendous interplay of politics with all of this.
Yes, thanks.
Friar Tim,
Yeah, Pete.
did this low liturgy focus continue into the mid 20th century? Because I can remember as a young altar boy doing a 21-minute
Yep.
Latin Mass.
Yep.
It was still going on.
Absolutely.
In our lifetime.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. The Irish never developed, frankly speaking, in the United States, Irish immigration never developed a high sense of church. It just never did. It just really never did. Somebody else was going to say something. Tom?
Yes. Friar Tim, was there what diocese or archdiocese had a lot of prominence during this period of the Irish immigration?
Okay. The hierarchy of the United States in 1853, the American Catholic hierarchy petitioned Pope Pius IX to declare the Archbishop of Baltimore the primate of Ireland, the primate of the United States. Pius IX refused. Again, this is the area of papal primacy. He did, however, grant the title of premier diocese to the Archbishop of Baltimore. So, in effect, the Archbishop of Baltimore was the head of the Catholic Church in the United States, which continued all the way along until the death of James Cardinal Gibbons at 91 years of age in 1921. Now, already by the 1880s, New York became a cardinalatial see. And already in the 1880s, the Archbishop of New York was wielding considerable power within the American Church. So, very commonly, there would be a certain tussle of precedence between Baltimore and New York. By the 1920s, the cardinalatial sees in the United States expanded to include Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Now, of those 5 American dioceses, generally, the leadership would depend very much on which of the American cardinals had the best connections in Rome. And from the teens into the 20s, that would have been the Cardinal of Boston. In the post-war period, it would have been Cardinal Spellman in New York. And now the sign of power in the American Church is which American cardinal sits on the Congregation for Bishops. Essentially, there are 2 American cardinals traditionally. One handles all the dioceses in the east part of the country, the other handles the dioceses in the west part of the country. You'll get a tip-off why Boston and the sex abuse scandal in Boston was such a difficult problem, was because Bernard Cardinal Law had been on that bishops' committee for decades. And Bernie Law put dozens of his priests in Episcopal dioceses. So the tentacles of clergy sex abuse went all over the place. You'll understand another piece of this, that just last week, one American aged off of that committee, and that would be Donald Cardinal Wuerl of Washington, who turned 80. So everyone is now waiting to see who is going to be the East Coast kingmaker on that committee.
Thank you.
Anytime. Dishing clerical dirt is always fun.
All right, Tim, can I ask one more?
Yeah.
What about the West Coast during the 19th century? Were they just off the screen, or the Spanish influence was there and yet
The Spanish influence was there, but essentially until the 1850s and the California gold rush, the West Coast was completely off the radar screen.
Okay.
And it's only the California gold rush which very quickly elevates San Francisco into an archdiocese. And San Francisco, in many ways, emulates the exact same patterns that are going on in the rest of the country.
Thank you.
LA is completely a creation of air conditioning in the 20s and 30s. San Francisco is the 19th century true diocese. Okay, from Ireland to Germany. Approximately 1.5 million Germans immigrated to the United States before the Civil War. Another 3.5 million immigrated afterwards. Now, an important thing to keep in mind, while the vast majority of the Irish were Catholic, only 30 to 40% of the German immigrants were Catholic. Why? As a result of the wars of religion and the Protestant Reformation, essentially the central, northern, and eastern parts of Germany were Protestant. Bavaria and the Rhineland were Catholic, and the areas down towards Austria. So that's approximately 30 to 40% of the German population remained Catholic. Germany was, at this time, completely overpopulated. And in fact, Germany has been overpopulated since the Middle Ages.
Oh,
There's a whole question in German and European history that Adolf Hitler exploited. In Germany, it's called Drang nach Osten, the drive towards the east. Since the Middle Ages, the excess German population has been pouring into underpopulated Eastern Europe. So up until the Second World War, Romania, Hungary, Bohemia, Slovakia, Ukraine, Russia, and the Baltic states in the Northeast all had significant German populations that remained German and in fact kept their own dialect of Ostdeutsch, which is a recognized dialect within Germany. This overpopulated Germany was just beginning two processes. First, industrialization. Generally, it's understood that England came first with industrialization, followed by France, followed by Germany, followed by Italy. So Germany was just starting this industrial revolution, which in the case of Germany would have centered in the Ruhr Valley, where there was abundant coal, which therefore allowed for the development of steel, much like Pittsburgh. Okay? The Ruhr Valley is much like Pittsburgh, frankly speaking. The second piece to keep in mind is Germany is beginning to become nationalized. Prior to the Napoleonic Wars, there were over 300 separate German states. After the Napoleonic Wars, that number was reduced to approximately 30. But still, at the time of mass immigration, Germany was divided up into 30 small states. The largest of them being Prussia in the northeast corner of Germany, which vied for control in leading this German nationalization process with Austria in the southeast part of the German heartland. If the Irish immigrated as single, unmarried men and women, the Germans emigrated as families. And they emigrated as families with limited but real means. First, many of them were better educated than the Irish. Secondly, many of them possessed tools. And many of them immigrated with their farm tools, or their printing presses, or their knowledge of how to brew beer. Three very typical German immigrant occupations in the New World. So therefore, they arrived several steps above the Irish on the hierarchy chain of who's going to make out well in the New World. If the Irish settled deliberately in the cities to find jobs, the Germans spread out into both cities and rural settlements. So again, it's not uncommon to drive through some small town in Indiana or Illinois and see a name like Bismarck, North Dakota, or Teutopolis, Illinois. Again, these small towns were founded by these Germans primarily either, in those cases, small towns, very common small farming families. German immigration had a high level of lay organization in parishes. This whole network of those of you of a certain age that will remember things like sodalities and confraternities and parish societies, the generic name for them in German is the Verein. These Vereinen were set up, very common what was done in Germany. So every German parish would have a married woman's society, a married man's society, an unmarried woman's society, an unmarried men's society. They would have a drama league, they would have a reading league, they would have a marching band, they would have a sports league, they would have devotional societies for this and for that and for this and for that. And these German societies, essentially, these Vereinen, were the pastoral strategy that German pastors used to organize their parish. Of course, these also served a very interesting thing, that when there was a big celebration in a nearby German parish, these sodalities, these Vereinen would get in their outfits and their marching bands and go en masse to the other German parish to support them. So it was very common in these periods that in some German parish you had 1,200 people crammed in and 5,000 people in the streets around listening through the windows. Everybody in uniform, everybody well organized. These German parishes had elaborate liturgy. 19th century travelers would marvel at the fact that they would stop in some Catholic church in some podunk, dumpy little town in the middle of nowhere in middle America and hear a superb choir singing
Excuse me?
Mozart Mass at the High Mass.
Oh, yeah.
That is quite common.
Did Rob tell you that?
That is quite common. In addition, the Germans very quickly developed a whole infrastructure.
Right.
The Germans
Yeah.
developed a whole infrastructure. And this infrastructure included.
Right, exactly.
Okay, if somebody's behind the conversation, please mute yourself. Thank you.
It seems odd that everyone wouldn't get notified at the same time, but who knows? It's COVID, it's 2020.
Infrastructure.
But it's a beautiful day, Morris. Exactly. Yeah.
Kim, please please mute yourself.
Thank you. This German language infrastructure started with schools. The original foundation of friars in the United States was German speaking, so I did a good amount of research in this. In every single category, the founding document to found a parish school states that the schoolmaster must be German and speak German as his mother language, period. They were very clear that schools were going to inculcate this. Organizations, including national organizations and sodalities, and newspapers. There was a whole series of German language newspapers that supported all of this. German Catholics were determined to maintain their ethnic identity. And they were also very conscious of being a double ethnic minority. That is, they were Germans in an American land, and they were Catholics in a predominantly Protestant Germany. So therefore, there is this double set of insulation where the German Catholics were rock bottom bound to maintain both their German identity and their Catholic identity. Now, this group of German Catholics did not make any attempt to assimilate until the First World War. Interestingly, there's a tremendous amount of anti-German feeling because of the sinking of the Lusitania, because of the Zimmerman telegram in which the German government invited the Mexicans to invade the Southwest and take back Texas and California, because of the atrocities, the burning of the Louvain Library, and the slaughter of Belgian babies, et cetera, the use of tear gas, all of these kinds of things. It became very, very politically incorrect to be German in the years 1914 to 1918. For example, there used to be in downtown Baltimore German Street, which in 1915 changed its name to Liberty Street. Sauerkraut became known as Liberty Cabbage. Okay, so there's this tremendous movement. I did some research in the archives of the Archdiocese of Baltimore, which I looked at all of the German parishes. All of the German parishes in 1914 published their parish bulletins completely in German. By 1918, they published their bulletins completely in English. Okay? So, rapid assimilation. Now, if the Irish controlled church politics through most of the United States, the Germans controlled church politics in 3 ecclesiastical provinces. Right? Ecclesiastical provinces, that's the archdiocese and the dioceses around them, and this time read the state. So essentially, the states of Ohio, Wisconsin, and Missouri were controlled by German bishops and German priests and German clergy. They were a very small German bloc in an otherwise Irish sea in the United States. Okay. Comments or questions? We'll start with the Zoomers first. She's got to unmute you. She's got to unmute you. Give her a second.
Can you unmute yourself?
Not if you muted them. Go down to participants. I think you can.
Okay, so I'm not muted anymore. Okay.
Okay.
Why did the Catholics in the Rhine area maintain their religion? When the Lutherans wanted them.
Very interesting question. Why did the Rhineland remain Catholic? The Rhineland remained Catholic mostly because of German Holy Roman Empire politics.
Okay.
3 archbishops of the Rhineland, Cologne, Mainz, and Trier, were electors of the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, 3 of the 7 votes to elect the Holy Roman Emperor came from 3 archbishops.
Okay.
The House of Habsburg in Austria, allied with the Bavarian royal family of the Wittelsbachs, were extremely successful in implanting their second sons into dioceses all along the Rhineland. Now, these Wittelsbach cadet sons may have been morally dissolute and dumb as bricks. However, they were Catholic to the core.
Yes.
And they never had to worry that one of these guys was going to become Protestant. So essentially, it's the political work of Catholic counter-reformation that maintained the Rhineland as Catholic.
Yes, that's what yes, that makes sense. Yes. And they could be as dumb as bricks.
Oh, as long as you were Catholic. Yes.
Was the experience of the German Protestant immigrants different from their assimilation?
And the question is German Protestant assimilation. I believe that the German Protestants assimilated at a somewhat more rapid pace. But still, there are any number of, especially Lutheran churches, older Lutheran churches in the Northeast and the Upper Midwest. When you look, the stained glass windows are still written in German. So it was a little bit more rapid than the Catholic variety, but still relatively slow regarding the rate of assimilation. The Irish assimilated very quickly. Yeah, they had the language. They knew the imperial language. They could step up very quickly.
Pete has a question.
Pete. Got unmuted.
I tried. I don't know why I can't do this.
Well, they can do it from there. They can't, they're.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, sorry. St. Louis, for example, the home of Anheuser-Busch. The German influence is obvious.
Yeah.
How big a minority was the Catholic immigration groups that settled in Cincinnati, St. Louis, and around compared to the rest of the German population?
Again, it's estimated at 30 to 40%, which
Oh, I'm
would be the general estimation of what the Catholic population of Germany was.
I'm sorry, I missed that. Okay.
Yes.
I heard a question about the Lutherans and assimilation and everything.
Yeah.
That's most of my family heritage, so I can't speak about everywhere, but certainly in Indiana and Terre Haute, they behave very much like the Catholics did in terms of a very isolationist approach. They had a whole separate Lutheran infrastructure. They were part of the Indiana-Kentucky Synod, not part of some of the others.
Yeah.
And certainly all of their liturgies. My grandmother talked a lot about that pivot in 1914, 1915, particularly after the U.S. came into the war.
Yep.
In 1917, everything flipped overnight with the anti-German sentiment, even in the Lutheran Church. Same thing. The prayer books and everything went from 100% German to English within about a year and a half or 2 years.
Okay, this is the first wave of immigrants. A little bit of immigrant spirituality. If you remember last time we talked about nativism, that is, that the Americans didn't welcome immigrants and also didn't welcome Catholic immigrants who were doubly strange. This sense of nativism forces the Catholic immigrants to retreat into enclave. Enclave is a nice word for ghetto. Forces them in a process very strongly supported by bishops and priests. Schools, hospitals, orphanages, Catholic parishes become safe centers to protect the immigrants from being preyed upon and poached upon by the Protestants. That's just simply the way things work. Certain figures in this time frame begin to inculcate a certain immigrant spirituality. Archbishop Martin Spalding of Baltimore in the post-Civil War period stresses the importance of the hierarchical church. See how much better organized we are than those Protestants, because we have a very clear hierarchical church. Because of that hierarchical church, we can protect you better than they can. Moreover, in a very clear harkening back to the Council of Trent that connected church to priesthood and hierarchy to Eucharist, Spalding began to inculcate a lot of penitential practices around the sacrifice of the Mass. So this is the period, for example, when Eucharistic fasting and abstinence on Friday becomes a Catholic badge of honor. This is the period where penitential practices such as nocturnal adoration of the Blessed Sacrament are strongly inculcated to inoculate the immigrant population from Protestantism. A couple of weeks ago, Treese came to Friday Night Adoration and made a comment about how the smell of incense is such a Catholic smell. Again, you know, in those old churches where decades of incense and beeswax and linseed oil to do all of the wood does create a certain old-fashioned Catholic smell that those of us will recognize that grew up in these kinds of things. Archbishop John Hughes of New York, whom I refer to as a result of the nativism as Dagger John. Dagger John was most instrumental in bringing external devotional Catholicism to the United States as a way to connect the immigrants. Furthermore, Dagger John believed that the bigger and the more splendid you could build a church, the more you could metaphorically do this to the Protestant elites to cover things. And of course, the classic example is right smack on Fifth Avenue, St. Patrick's Cathedral. Now, this was replicated in virtually every large American city full of immigrants. I remember my mother telling me, in the 1920s, our home parish, the friar pastor built a splendid 1,400-seat neo-Romanesque church. That's my home parish. In the 1920s, and they paid it off in the 1930s with immigrant dimes and nickels. And my mother, as a little girl, has clear memories of the pastor builder of Benedict with the unpronounceable last name of Chmielewski, Ben Chmielewski, preaching on Sundays. When that collection comes around, I don't want to hear the clink of coins, I want to hear the rustle of bills. But that church that year was declared the single best example of art and architecture to decorate the city of Baltimore. That's the mentality that went behind a lot of this. Hughes also stressed holy days. The sacrifice of Catholics who on holy days of obligation would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to come to morning mass before going to work, or would straggle in the evenings when evening masses were allowed. That was only in the 1950s. There were no vigil masses. So people would be coming to church at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:30 in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, in order to make the holy days of obligation. These were stressed as a badge of Catholic identity. Catholic devotion was full of prayer and petition. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. It's during this period that Catholics also have, in essence, what is the Catholic alternative to the big tent revival in Pentecostal churches. That is, Lenten missions. And Lenten missions, essentially, would be a team of priests, frequently in the United States. These would either be Jesuits or Redemptorists, and then later on, the Paulists also joined in this. And the goal of this was lots of hellfire and brimstone preaching designed to do two things.
Unknown caller.
Secondly, after you went to confession, going to make a worthy communion. And these were large-scale, all-day events that sometimes went 6, 7, 8, 10 days. St. John of Neumann, the Archbishop of Philadelphia, stressed particularly Mary and 40 hours devotions and Benedict. as classic examples of Catholic spirituality to inculcate a sense of spirituality to the flock. Around these devotions, there was a huge amount of sentiment and feeling and simple desire for intercession and help. I'm going to sing a verse that some of you of a certain age will remember from growing up. But just pay attention to the words. Mother dearest, mother fairest, help of all who call me. Virgin purest, brightest, rarest, help us, we cry to thee. Mary, help us, we pray. Mary, help us, we pray. Help us in all care and sorrow. Mary, help us, we pray. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times in 8 verses the word help appears. Very emblematic of what that devotional piety was like that the immigrants began in the 19th century, and which continued, frankly, straight through into the 1950s and 1960s.
Who is Frederick William Faber?
Frederick William Faber was a hymn writer who wrote a number of these very sentimental hymns in the 19th century. The most famous of them is Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death. That's Frederick William Faber.
Thank you. Okay.
The second wave of immigration, post-Civil War, until 1924. 1924 is when the United States federal government basically closed the borders to immigration. Statistics. 1896 is the cutoff year in American immigration studies. Prior to 1896, immigration is mostly from Northern and Western Europe. Scots-Irish, Irish, German, Scandinavian. From post-1896, it's predominantly Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Greeks, Russians, Slavs of all kinds, and Arabs. Over 1 million Catholic immigrants arrived each decade from 1880 to 1920.
Wow.
In the first decade of the 20th century, 2 million Catholic immigrants. In a 30-year period, the Catholic population rose 260%, while the American population rose 21%. The Catholic Church grew at a rate 10 times faster than the American state.
Is that because of immigration?
This is immigration.
Yeah.
In the year 1890, 80% of the population of metropolitan New York was either an immigrant or the son or the daughter of an immigrant. Now, what you have to picture is, what does it take to absorb these hordes of immigrants? What does it take to build churches, schools, etc., for these hordes of immigrants? That's a major, major challenge for the late 19th century, early 20th century church. We'll look at the Italians first. First, keep in mind that really, at this point, saying the word Italian is a misnomer. Italy only became a united nation in 1864 or 1870, depending on how you call it. Italy, all through the 19th century and into the 20th century, remained an uneasy confederation of local regions, each with their own dialect, each with their own form of life and culture and style. People from Bari look down upon people from Sicily. People from Tuscany look down upon people from the Marches. People from the Marches despise people from the Veneto, etc., etc., etc. So when these immigrant groups arrived, they very commonly arrived in village units. You can always tell, for example, an Italian national church in which Italians from different regions show up, because when you walk into the church, you will sometimes see 15 to 20 statues of the Blessed Virgin. Why? These are the 15 or 20 village patron Marys that came back to the old country, and woe to you if you don't put my Mary up on the tabernacle. So very commonly, this is a pattern in Italian churches. Again, much like the Irish, these were peasants. One of the big differences is while Irish women went out to work, Italian women stayed home to cook the pasta. There's virtually no Italian immigrant women working outside the church. The other interesting pattern about the Italians of all the immigrant groups had the highest percentage of people who would go back to Italy. When the Poles and the Germans and the Irish left, they were glad to be rid of the old country. The Italians, however, simply wanted to raise enough money to be able to go back to their native village, buy a big piece of land, and act like an important person back in the home village. So there's this large rate of back and forth travel among the Italians, which, by the way, leads to a particular pastoral problem. Among many Italian immigrant men, there was a problem of bigamous marriages. That is, they had a wife in Hoboken and a wife in Milan. Very common pattern. These Italian immigrants had a high level of anti-clericalism. Italy is suffused with the Catholic Church, and bishops and priests exercise a prominent role. Bishops and priests also tended to be against the unification of Italy and in support of the papacy in Rome. So in the 19th century, anti-clericalism was rampant among Italians. It was particularly rampant among Italian males. So when you watch the Godfather movies, you know, Mama Corleone goes to Mass every day, Vito never. Typical, a fairly typical pattern of the Italian immigrant. There was a high level of religious illiteracy. The Italian catechetical program was quite poor. Pastoral care basically involved showing up for devotions. When this poorly catechized population arrived in the New World, without this whole bedrock of folkloric piety behind it, in many cases it collapsed. These Italian groups were much more interested in forming social clubs than parishes. And all of this altogether began to be noted in the press, both in Italy and the United States, as quote unquote the Italian problem. Interestingly, the notifications of this in the press led a northern Italian noblewoman named Francesca Zaveria Cabrini to seek an audience with Pope Leo XIII and ask him to provide something for the Italian problem. And Leo XIII looked her right back in the eye and said, "Why don't you go and do it?" And essentially she did, and founded a foreign mission society to send Italian priests and Italian religious women, most particularly to shore up the Catholicity of the Italian immigrants during this period. My people. If Italy was still regions loosely bound together, Poland did not exist. Prussia, Russia, and Austria in the 18th century had carved up and obliterated Poland, so it was off the map of Europe during the entire 19th century. Immigration patterns tended to follow this same pattern. Immigration in the 1880s is from predominantly German Poland. German Poland would be the areas today along the Baltic and along what is today southwest Poland, around what is the city of Wrocław in Poland today, which was known as the German city of Breslau in that period. In the 1890s, it would have been from Austrian Poland, which is the area around Krakow and southeast Poland. And finally, after 1900, from Russian Poland, which would be the areas of Warsaw and to the east. These are three distinct groups which had not interacted with one another for 120 years. So therefore, you can understand that these three groups may have fought among themselves. Poles and Polish immigrants were notoriously cantankerous and difficult. There are any number of cases of Polish immigrants murdering their pastors, locking themselves in the church and being put under interdict by the bishop, attacking the bishop when he came for confirmation. Notorious. In addition to this cantankerous thing, Polish culture had divided along two class lines. What was called the clericalist and the nationalist. The clericalist line stated that when the Russians, Prussians, and Austrians obliterated us, they made us do everything in German or in Russian in school, but damn it, we pray in Polish. So it is the priests and the bishops and the church that is the historic protector of Polish identity. By the way, this is playing out even today in Polish politics. Between the right-wing party, which is the clericalist party, which is in power now, and the left-wing party, which is the more nationalist party. The other argument is, no, it is the Polish intelligentsia, it is the Polish cultural class, it is the Polish poets and authors, Mickiewicz, etc., that maintain Polish culture. So between Austrian, Russian, Prussian, clericalist, nationalist, we've got a whole stew of antagonisms that these Polish immigrants brought with them. For the most part, they were unskilled laborers. The men worked in factories, mills, and mines, and the women were the archetypal, quote, Polish cleaning ladies. Very, very common thing in the early part of the 20th century. The Polish immigrant was most interested in saving money in order to buy his own home. Why? Because the nobleman can't kick me out of my own home. Polish neighborhoods in these cities are filled with tiny storefront savings and loans and banks. Every Polish family scraped its nickels and dimes together in order to buy a home. Now, interestingly, the Poles exhibited very little social mobility. Once they had a home, they were fine. If their son continued to want to work in the factory, mill, or mine, great, it's a safe job. They didn't necessarily propel their sons, most particularly and especially their daughters, into higher education or into job status. They were very content. As long as you own your own home, you're sitting very, very pretty. Polish parishes recreated essentially Polish villages in the Middle Atlantic, New England, and the Great Lakes. I grew up in one of these Polish villages in southeast urban Baltimore. The cantankerous, difficult Poles also experienced the only serious schism in American Catholic history. As the Polish immigrants arrived, the first ones especially, from Austria and Prussian Poland, they could speak some German. So they naturally congregated around the German parishes. And the German parishes said, sure, we have a basement church, you worship there and we worship above. And of course the Poles were not happy to be metaphorically stepped upon by the Germans, considering they had been stepped upon by the Germans back in Poland. And very often used the same thing, saving their nickels and dimes to build and buy their own church. Very commonly, a Polish Benevolent Association would raise enough money to build a church, then they'd call the Irish bishop and say, Bishop, we have money for a church, we built the land. And the bishop would say, turn the deed over to me.
Yeah.
And the Poles said, trick me once, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice. And there's a long, long series of cantankerous Polish battles with bishops and area pastors. Around the year 1900, the bishops of Chicago, Buffalo, and Scranton had excommunicated Polish parishes with their pastors. One of these pastors from Scranton, Pennsylvania, Bishop Hodor, traveled back to Europe to modern-day Netherlands, where he found a schismatic Archbishop of Utrecht who consecrated him as a Roman Catholic bishop. And he came back and organized these dissident parishes to form the Polish National Catholic Church. In Polish, this would be known as the Narodowi, the Nationals. And of course, clericalist nationalists, many of the nationalists went into this direction. Polish pastors spent an inordinate amount of time making sure that their people didn't go over to these dissident churches. Our friars are involved in this because very commonly we were called in to quell problems in immigrant parishes. I'll tell you my own family story. My father's mother got into a lockdown, drag-out fight with her pastor and basically flipped him the bird and walked out to the local Polish National Church. Her 3 sons were all baptized Roman Catholic, but they had switched to become Polish National. all three of her sons, including her eldest, my father, all fell in love with Polish Roman Catholic girls. And it was very clear, no conversion, no nookie. And my mother tells the story of having to go to confession for dating. The dirty Polish word for this, which my mother always said while spitting, is, I was dating a vodhole. This is the only significant immigrant schism. It affected perhaps 5% of Polish immigrants. This church is still around. This church is still around in those three areas. It's still around. It's very small, but it's still around. French Canadians. There's a large immigration from Quebec beginning in the year 1880. Basically, this was for economic advancement into New England for the textile and the paper industry. Is John Sullivan among us today? Is John there? Yeah. So John, you would know this from New England. Okay? These French Canadians, working families, men and women worked in the mill towns of New England. Religion is tied tightly to French Canadian nationalism. You ever seen a Quebec license plate, which I'm sure you've seen many of them all the way to Myrtle Beach in the winters? The Quebec license plate on the bottom, the motto is Je me souviens, which means I remember. What do I remember? Every single slight that ever happened to me by the Anglophones. Very tightly tied in together. Much like in Louisiana, this is a place where trusteeism continued to work very well. And trusteeism continued this French-Canadian subculture, which is still extant in New England. Many New England dioceses have internal fights between their French clergy and their Irish clergy. And the Holy See has typically resolved this by switching off bishops. An Irish bishop is succeeded by a French bishop by an Irish bishop, and then the Irish bishop has to choose a French-Canadian vicar general. This is how they kept the faith. This is how they kept peace in these areas. Great tension with the Irish majority. Other Eastern immigrants from smaller Eastern countries, the Slovaks and the Lithuanians, they're very similar socially to the Poles, and in many ways are very allied to the Poles in their own experience. The Bohemians are less Catholic, they're more German, and they're more skilled. So they don't quite fit into the same pattern. But then we have the very unique experience of the Ukrainians and the Ruthenians. Around the year 1600, a number of Orthodox bishops from what is today the western part of Ukraine, the western part of Belarus, the eastern part of Slovakia, and the eastern part of Poland. Many of these bishops brought their dioceses into union with the Pope of Rome, while maintaining their own ancestral, linguistic, liturgical culture. Those that spoke Ukrainian formed into the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which was completely driven underground by the communists in 1919 and was the largest underground church until it resurrected in 1990.
Oh.
And the Ruthenians. Ruthenorum is the Latin word for Russian. So any group that spoke Russian was joined into the Ruthenian Church. In the latter part of the 19th and early part of the 20th century, these Ruthenian and Ukrainian immigrants arrived in the United States with their priests. So you have to picture what this looks like. Some, Bishop O'Flannery in some diocese looks on his calendar and says, oh, I got to meet some priests from Ukraine at 10 o'clock. All right. He goes and opens his office door. What does he see? It's some guy with beard down to here, big black hat and a veil, big pectoral cross, and his wife and 6 kids. Because the Eastern rites allow for married clergy. And the Ukrainian priest says, I want permission to start a Ukrainian church here. And this Irish bishop said, what? You're going to scandalize my flock. Moreover, you're going to scandalize my priests. Because you're here with your wife and kids. Very commonly, the local bishop would state, I'll let you do this, but you have to send your wife and kids back to the old country.
Yeah, yeah.
And many of these clergy were simply horrified. And the vast majority of this clergy, in order to remain faithful to their wife and children, left the Catholic Church and reunited back with Orthodoxy. The Latin Rite bishops forced the Holy See to impose clerical celibacy on these Ukrainian and Ruthenian priests in the United States, even though this was completely against their traditions and completely against their ecclesiastical discipline. This restriction to celibate clergy for the Ruthenian and the Ukrainians was only lifted less than 10 years ago. So, Therese, you grew up in Pittsburgh. The area is full of these Ukrainian and Ruthenian. Yeah, packed. I believe the Ruthenian diocese is Pittsburgh and the Ukrainian archdiocese is Philadelphia. So these areas are packed with them. So again, perhaps 65% of the Orthodox in the United States today were at one time in union with us, and we forced it out. A very sad chapter in American ethnic relations. Now, this leads to the other major topic, the Americanization of immigrants. There was a general agreement that the immigrants needed to be Americanized. The real question is, how fast? The Irish tended to want to do it much more quickly than the Germans. In 1886, a group of German Catholics in the United States, led by Father Peter Abelin, protested to Rome, stating that the American bishops are not forming national parishes or ethnic parishes. Moreover, if they do that, they still try to make the ethnic pastor not really a pastor, but subject to the local Irish pastor.
Yeah.
Moreover, the ethnic pastors do not have full rights, and the only way that we're going to be able to protect ourselves is for the Holy See to impose German vicars general. In 1890, another protest came in through the Bavarian Foreign Mission Society, the Raphaelsverein. And this got the Holy See's attention. The immigrants are losing their faith. Raphael Stein suggested that if 20% of the population is German, 20% of the bishops should be German, etc., etc. Proportionalism. Mandated national groupings in dioceses. The Irish bishops replied back, we do not want to turn the United States into the Balkans, where every 25 yards there's another country. We're one nation under God, and we're going to Americanize these immigrants while respecting all of their stuff. And the Holy See never really stepped in here, but essentially what happened is there got to be a little bit of a compromise. Each diocese or each bishop did it slightly differently. A very common pattern was predominantly Irish bishop. Let's say he knew he had a lot of Poles in his diocese. And Poles didn't like the Irish, and Irish didn't like the Poles. He would pick a trusted Polish priest, name him Monsignor, and in effect, name him as the titular head of all the German priests, of all the Polish priests in the area. So, for example, every newly ordained Polish seminarian was assigned to him for his first assignment. And then this guy said, oh, he's a loser, he's a drunk, no. And essentially, this Polish Monsignor ran his ethnic clergy like a little ethnic mafia. And in huge dioceses like Chicago, there was one of these for the Germans, one for the Slovaks, one for the Poles, one for the Italians, one for the Lithuanians, one for the Croatians, one for the Bohemians, etc., etc., etc. This is how most American dioceses maneuver around all of this. What saved the faith is the ethnic parish. The ethnic parish is a canonical parish based on nationality. Now, all of you are members of essentially one of these national parishes.
Yes, yes, yes.
The only difference is that your nationality is being connected to UNC.
Yes.
We are not a territorial parish. We are exactly like a national parish.
Yes.
That is not a language that binds us, it's our connection to UNC that binds us.
Yes.
Canonically, sometimes these were referred to as, quote, chapels of ease, unquote. Very 19th century phrase that you see in canonical language. These ethnic parishes strongly believe that faith is preserved through language. When they had parish schools, inevitably, school was taught in the ancestral language in the morning and in English in the afternoon. Okay? How many of you went to Catholic grade school? What's the first thing in every Catholic grade school curriculum? What's the first subject you study in the morning?
Religion.
Religion. So, of course, that meant that you learned your religion in the ancestral language.
Yes.
Okay? Now, this was my mother. My mother, by her 80s, could barely make her way through Polish. I spoke better Polish than my mother by the time she was in her 80s. My mother insisted on going to confession in Polish because she never learned how to do it in English. And by the time she was in her 70s, she was too embarrassed to ask for instructions on how to do it. And she would jokingly say, I prefer to go to confession in Polish because the sins sound better. Reality, of course, I suspect my mother was confessing the same sins that she did when she was 7 or 8.
Yes, yes.
Right? Yeah, because I really doubt my mother knew sophisticated sins in Polish. Even if she would have committed them, I doubt whether she would know how to confess them. Preaching was always done in the name of language. Devotions were always done in the name of language. I grew up in the last vestiges of this in the 60s and 70s, and every devotion in my parish was done in Polish.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Stations of the Cross in Polish. I sang the Litany of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Polish. I sang the Litany of the Sacred Heart in Polish. I went to Polish Lenten Lamentations.
Yes.
Lenten Lamentations in Polish are called gorzkie żale, meaning bitter tears. It's these series of sung lamentations. And my father would frequently complain that going with my mother caused bitter tears because she was so tone deaf. Okay? This is typical in these passages. These social societies and confraternities recreated the home village. There's a landmark study in 1925 by a priest sociologist named Gerald Shaughnessy. Has the immigrant kept the faith? And his answer was yes. Why? National parishes and this whole web of organizations. Where did we lose the faith? We lost the faith with people who came over with weak faith because they were poorly catechized. And this would have been the case in Ireland, in Italy. That's where we lost immigrants. One last group, Mexican immigration. This is consistent all during the 19th century and accelerated into the 20th century. This is the entire Southwest, from Texas straight through into California. This is the only immigrant group that when they crossed the Rio Grande, they went down in economic mobility. Mexican clergy is consistently clergy poor and intensely connected to popular religion. Clergy poor explains why Father Scott McHugh had to learn Spanish. Devotionally intense, the mass celebrations around Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Yes.
This actually raises a question. Is it fair to call these people immigrants? Or is it more honest to say the borders just changed on them?
Yeah.
Considering that Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California all one time belonged to Mexico. Are borders artificial or not? Stop. Questions? We'll start with in-house.
Mm.
Yes.
It's a little more of a comment. My father was born in Ireland, my grandparents also. I didn't realize that they were liturgy poor. My experience wasn't, my father died when I was young, but he was closely associated with the church. According to my mother, when they got married, he was sending money back to that church in Ireland, and that guy wasn't in good shape, and he went back.
Yeah.
And checked to see the money going.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like a little bit of a disconnect to me.
But a sense, again, keep in mind that the Irish in Ireland didn't have, quote unquote, the integrity to keep up their own church. They needed the Irish uncle in America to do that for them. Yeah, he'd come from there. Yeah. Okay, Zoomers.
So we're supposed to ask you a question, right?
Or comment.
Okay, so I'll make a comment. I went to parochial school from grade 1 to, and I graduated high school, and our alumni association from 1962 to present, very active, and the parish school remains no longer a high school, but it's connected with Boston College, so it gets its teachers there. So as I'm learning about the influence of the immigration, different countries and all, I'm really, I am impressed how deep the connection, even if people aren't practicing Catholicism anymore or whatever, their identity with this parish is very strong to this day.
Bishops, the comment is how deeply connected people are with their ethnic parish. Bishops learn this to their chagrin when they try to close ethnic parish in the middle of some city that may not have spoken the ancestral language for 50 years and might be reduced to 62 old ladies. But when the bishop tries to close it, people go crazy. And I'll give you an example. The Bishop of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, closed a Croatian church. The Croatians, every Sunday night from 9 p.m. until 2 in the morning, got permission from the local police to play Croatian national music outside the Bishop of Harrisburg's bedroom. And they kept up this for 3.5 years. Okay? 3.5 years.
And what did the bishop do?
The bishop couldn't do a thing because it wasn't against sound ordinances. I suspect that the local chief of police was probably Croatian. But that gives you an idea. So when bishops try to avoid closing churches as much as they possibly can, and when they do, especially these ethnic churches, they try to do it with a great level of delicacy. Yeah.
Tim?
Yeah.
Well, comment. In Toledo, Ohio, where my wife and I.
Very ethnic.
Yes, very, very. And specifically, the bishop closed a Polish parish, long-standing, historically based Polish parish. That parish went through 2 crises after that. One over the closing of its status as a parish. The second was tearing the church down.
Yes.
Oh, that was really serious. And that issue stood still for a number of years, maybe 10 years, until finally the city came to some compromise whereby they would maintain the church building as a cultural center.
Yep. I can tell you another story. Back in the 1980s, General Motors wanted to build a large plant in a Polish neighborhood in Detroit. The Archbishop of Detroit cooperated by closing several Polish parishes in that neighborhood. As the wrecking ball was ready to hit one of these churches, one of the Polish pastors chained himself to the front door of the church to prevent the wrecking ball. As the police came to drag him away, the overweight Polish pastor collapsed and died of a heart attack and became a martyr to the population of Detroit. And golly gee, the Archbishop backed off. These are the kinds of stories that happen in ethnic.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Tom first.
I think that African American parishes would
We'll talk about African American parishes, but essentially, African American parishes canonically were treated exactly the same as an ethnic national parish. However, there is one big difference. The Polish parishioner, his or her grandchildren, when they no longer knew Polish, were free to go to another church. The African American grandchildren were still African American and weren't going anywhere, and weren't allowed to go anywhere. That's the big difference. But essentially, you're correct. It's the exact same pattern. Yes. At the very beginning, but there's still quite a few. Go ahead.
But there's still some mistakes, so like Roman Catholic Eucharist there, is that?
Yes. In fact, one of your professors is an Eastern Rite member, one of these, I think he's Ruthenian. You know who I'm talking about?
I consider
Yeah. He comes always outside the evening mass. Hugo. Hugo's a member of, I think he's Ruthenian. Yeah. So again, communion is completely possible. The only difficulty would be to put in, for example, if you were to marry someone from this rite, it would have to be an understanding as to where you're going to raise the children. Because Catholic canon law protects the rights of minority rights. Okay? So for example, another end of this is if many of these people are baptized in their native rite, but grow up Roman Catholic, because that's what the local Catholic school is. If they enter seminary, they have to get permission from their bishop of that rite to leave the rite and become Roman Catholic as a priest. But yeah, there are still any number of these around. Let's see, the Ruthenians have dioceses in Passaic and Pittsburgh. The Ukrainians have dioceses in Philadelphia, Parma, Ohio, and California someplace. There's also Romanians. There's a number of different groups of Eastern Rite bishops. When you'll see big celebrations of bishops, these are the guys wearing crowns and not mitres. Yes. Yeah. Byzantine is the generic term. Okay, briefly, the third wave of immigration. The United States opened up immigration patterns in 1965. Currently, 35 to 40% of American Catholics are Latino. The majority of Catholics under the age of 40 are Latino. Latinos are simply having more children than white Caucasians.
Right.
These Latino Catholics remain Catholic more often than Caucasians. It's estimated that 40% of American adults have spent time in another religion other than the one we're in right now. 40%. However, many of these Latino immigrants already arrive Pentecostal. The percentage of Catholics in Brazil, the world's largest Catholic country, in the last 30 years has dropped from 95% to 65%.
Yes.
It is estimated already that Guatemala is majority Pentecostal and no longer majority Catholic. This is in a number of other countries in Latin America. In addition to these Latino Catholics, there's a substantial number of Asian Catholics. Virtually every parish in the United States has a large and loyal subsection of Filipinos. The Koreans and the Vietnamese tend to want to have their own ethnic parishes. And there are both Korean and Vietnamese parishes in the Diocese of Raleigh. In addition, there are Indian Catholics. Now, the Indian Catholics have a particular issue involved with them. The area of, there's a state in India named Kerala in the southwestern part of India, which is the largest Christian area. This area claims to have been evangelized by St. Thomas the Apostle. And when St. Francis Xavier in the 16th century arrived there, he found already existing a flourishing Catholic church that came into union with the Church of Rome and is known as the Syro-Malabar Church. The vast majority of Indian priests who were serving in the United States were not raised in the Latin rite, but in the Syro-Malabar rite. And the Syro-Malabars have since erected their first diocese in the United States. So they are emulating the same Ruthenian and Ukrainian and Slovak pattern of the earlier immigrants. All of these have a higher level of religiosity than Caucasian Catholics. In other words, they show up in church more regularly. The bottom line is that in the not too distant future, American Catholicism will be a majority-minority religion. Oh, go back. Okay. Most of these immigrant groups, other than the Vietnamese and the Koreans, the American bishops are not willing to set up national parishes for these groups. Why? Well, they realize that the bishops in the Northeast and the upper Midwest have a huge brick and mortar problem of sometimes 5 Catholic churches on the same street belonging to 5 different ethnic groups, none of whom speak the language any longer, and each of them only has about 20 people left. So they much prefer, as American bishops, to use the St. Thomas More model. That is, 2 communities, one speaking English, one speaking Spanish, kind of coexisting in the same territorial parish. That tends to be the model. Many contemporary immigrants don't feel the need to be enculturated and Americanized at quite the rate that some of the European immigrants experienced. My first assignment was in a Polish national parish in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And we had one Polish friar that specifically handled Polish immigrants, and the rest were like Polish, like my parents, Polish immigrants from 100 years ago. I had an appointment once with a young couple who came in to have their child baptized. And these were recent Polish immigrants who would speak very broken English. So in my best broken Polish, I said to them, would you like to have the baptism ceremony done in Polish, in which case I'll get Father Jan, the Polish priest, who will work with you. And they said, no, Father, we do it English. We America, we do English. Okay, good, great. So this very Polish couple, I said, and what name have you given your son? And their answer was Kevin. It gives you the idea of how quickly they wanted to enculturate. Many other recent immigrants don't have that same kind of a load. These are people, particularly our Latino brothers and sisters, who have experienced American nativism, anti-immigrant, and anti-Catholic prejudice. Still, the United States is the golden land of opportunity. They may live in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, ghetto, or enclave, but not necessarily. Particularly here, for example, in Orange County, it's a question around economics. Our Hispanic population here tends to live in trailer parks, not in downtown Chapel Hill. Right, Connie? As we both learned from Orange County Justice United. If the traditional thing was the United States is a melting pot, like a fondue where everything melts in together, these immigrants view the United States much more as a salad bowl, in which the tomato is always the tomato, the cucumber is always the cucumber, the radish is always the radish, but there's a certain dressing that binds us all together. This will be exemplified, for example, by the immigrant patterns around Thanksgiving. Virtually everyone will have turkey as their main course, but it might start off with a lasagna appetizer or a kimchi appetizer or non-bread appetizer, which is how we tend to do it in these days. They're somewhat ambivalent about American culture. They tend to be much more conservative about sexual mores, family issues, etc. They tend to be very uncomfortable with politically correct language and a liberal secularist agenda. So they like America, but they're not thrilled with these kinds of things. When it comes to both the church and the government, they're mostly interested in service and resources. Because again, they're recent immigrants. This is what they need. The general immigration pattern in the United States has always been a three-generational pattern. Generation one, the adults come, speak English poorly, and prefer to do everything in their native language, including church. Their children, for the most part, are perfectly bilingual. Very commonly, their children have to translate for the parents regarding government services, legal stuff, etc. Their children, in turn, almost never learn the language. The only parts of the language that they know are the food words and the cuss words, but they maintain a strong connection to the cultural roots. That would be me. I'm third generation. My parents were born here, but their parents came from Poland. Questions, comments from the House first. The Zoomers.
So I have a comment. I did volunteer work out in Phoenix, Arizona in 64, 65 with some the friars, the Franciscans. Mm-hmm. And I worked at a church called Sacred Heart, and they had a school, and it was very vibrant. In fact, I became godmother to at least 5 or 6 kids because I was around in the office. They needed somebody. Yeah. I remember that. When I went back in 1970, and the majority of the parishioners were Spanish and Mexicans, and they were the crop, people, and would come, and you have to go back to
migrant farm workers.
Right, but yeah. When I went back in 73, it had changed. The parish was still there. The school had become a center, no longer anybody to teach there. And then a friend and I went back in 13, and there was such a protest of destroying the church, Sacred Heart, because it was very near the airport. They wanted to destroy it, but there was enough Latino or Mexican uprising. So if you go there now, the church remains, it's enclosed in a chain link fence.
Yeah.
And once a year on Christmas Eve, they celebrate Mass.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Again, it's the same level of ethnic attachment to churches. That's a very common phenomenon.
Yeah.
Pete. Can you unmute yourself? No. Therese has you muted.
I don't know what is going on here.
Yeah, the same thing was happening to me. I could not unmute myself unless Therese did it.
Okay, you're unmuted, Pete.
Oh, great, thank you. You talked about the Filipino, Korean, Vietnamese, and Indian. What about the priest vocations and the recruitment? We had in Hawaii, we had many Indonesian priests from the largest Islamic country in the world.
Yeah.
And they're just more and more becoming a part of the Catholic experience in America. Where do you think that's going? And
it's increasing. We have a religious province in Indonesia. It's the same set of issues. It's the largest Muslim country, but other than one region which has Sharia law, the rest of it is pretty religiously neutral.
Right.
So the Catholic Church does fairly well. In the United States, especially the Filipinos, the Koreans, and the Vietnamese, they have higher levels of vocations than their numbers indicate. So it's something like, if the population of the United States is Catholic Church is 1% Vietnamese, like 5% of the priests are Vietnamese.
Yeah, okay.
Because again, they're much more intentionally religious than their Caucasian brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
This goes back to when you were talking about the other Eastern Europeans. I had trouble with the mute. I remember my great-grandmother was Czech and my great-grandfather was Slovak. And the Czechs put the Slovaks down. The Bohemians basically said, they said, you're not unskilled and all this other stuff like that. So whenever they get in a fight, she would always remind him about the fact that he was Slovak and he was not Bohemian,
And he probably reminded her that she really wasn't a Slav, she was half German.
Well, that's true. And the really funny thing is that all those women that all came over, there were 6 daughters in the late 1800s, all 6 of them, all except for my great-grandmother, the other 5 of them all married Germans.
Yeah. Bohemia, don't forget, part of the tragedy of the 1930s was Hitler's dismemberment of Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
In order to protect, quote unquote, the German minority in the Sudetenland, which is Bohemia.
Yep.
So, and again, all of those, by the way, were all expelled after the Second World War. Please keep in mind, for example, that the borders of Poland at 1945 were moved 400 miles to the west. And all of those Poles in that area were deported by the Russians.
Yeah.
And the Poles, in turn, deported all of the Germans from the Baltic region and down into Wrocław. And all of those Eastern Poles who had been displaced and deported simply came and took their homes in that area. There was a huge amount of ethnic cleansing took place in 1945 in order to, as much as possible, create countries with a homogeneous culture. For example, in 1939, Poland was only about 60% Roman Catholic.
Yep.
The rest were Jews, Protestants, Orthodox, and Eastern Catholics. In 1945, Poland was 98% Catholic. That gives you an idea. And that was repeated in a lot of other places in Europe, most dramatically in Poland.
Yep.
All right, thank you for your attention. You all stayed awake in the middle of the afternoon for this.
Yep.
Happy Thanksgiving. Make it a safe Thanksgiving, please. And then we'll be back the week after Thanksgiving for Black and Indigenous peoples, their experience of Catholicism in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. See you.
Thank
Happy
you,
Thanksgiving.
Friar Tim.
Yeah.
You guys are on the screen behind me. There you are.
Oh, okay, Trees.
Sorry for my technical skills or lack thereof. Take care.
Take care, everybody. Stay well.
Bye, Doug.
Thanks for enrolling me today.
Oh, you're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, I mean, I've taught this for a number of years. So this is all kind of,
Sort of like we did church history, and that was, well, it was a good measure. And now there's